We are going to be making 2 blocks this month. The first one is the Illinois block, and these are the fabrics for that block. So let's just run through them because they don't necessarily exactly match what the pattern says. This is the first fabric in the list. It's the beige and red print. The next one is the red with gold flowers. Ours does not have flowers. It has kind of squares in it. And then the next piece is the tan rectangle. And then we have a brown square, and ours has red and gold in that. And then we have the beige print rectangle, and it does have some red in it. And then the gold star square, there aren't any stars in it. And finally, our red strip. From our beige and red print, we are going to cut 2 3¼ inch squares. So it's plenty big enough. I'm going to square up 2 sides, and then 3¼ times 2 is 6½, and so we're going to measure 3¼ along the long edge and 6½ across the short edge that we just clean cut. 3¼ and cut. And then we're just going to slide the ruler back to the 3¼ mark. Make sure you line up lines on both long edges to keep everything square, and cut. From our largest red piece, we are going to cut 2 3¼ inch squares and 4 1 7/8 inch squares. So the first thing I'm going to do is, as always, square up or clean cut 2 edges. Could rotate the mat, and I'm going to go ahead. 2 3¼ inch squares is 6½, so I'm going to cut off my 6½ inch section so I don't make the other end too small for getting my 1 7/8. I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to come over to 3¼ and this time I'm going to line lines up on my short edge to keep everything straight. Back off to 3¼ and make sure I have lines going on my long edges to keep it all straight. I'm going to take these 2 squares and put them with my beige and red print, so that they're going to be a unit. So keep those together. Out of what's left of the red, the pattern tells us to cut 4 1 7/8 inch squares. I'm going to do my flying geese oversized, so I'm not going to cut them that size. You are welcome to cut them that size if you want, but I'm going to show you a ruler that I haven't shown you before. It's called the Wing Clipper. If you liked the Square Squared ruler by Studio 180, you're going to love the Wing Clipper. I had borrowed one to demo it and fell in love with it, so I own it now. Inside the directions that come with the Wing Clipper, there is a chart, and so you need to know what size your finished flying geese unit is going to be. And our pattern does tell us that we're going to trim it down after we make it so that it's 1½ by 2½, and that is our cut size. So if we go down here to the 1½ by 2½, it's going to finish at 1 by 2. So then it tells us our large square, and we have made the flying geese before, making 4 at once. Our large square is going to be 3½ inches, and our small square is going to be 2 inches, 4 of the small squares. So I'm going to cut the rest of the red into 4 2-inch squares. So 2 times 2 is 4. Cut that down to a 4-inch square. And I want to keep everything straight, so I'm lining up lines anywhere that I can. Then I'm going to back my ruler off to 2 inches. And if you're careful and don't move it, then you can just move over and cut it again, going the other direction in the 2 inches. So that gives us our 4 2-inch squares. This is the piece the pattern is calling the red with gold flowers, and from this we need 1 square. You can either cut it 1 7/8 inches, or if you have a squared ruler, we'll use that to cut it, because this is going to be the center of a square and a square unit. So the first thing I'm going to do is clean cut 2 edges. So if you don't have the square and a square ruler, then just cut a 1 7/8 inch square. I do have the square and a square unit. So what I want to look for is the where it says center square for 2-inch finished blocks, because that's what our square and a square unit is going to finish at, is 2 inches. So I'm going to line up the edges of that, and I'm going to cut my center square, which is going to be somewhere close to 1 7/8, but remember the squared ruler gives us a more accurate cut for that center square. So I'm going to set that one aside in a new pile. So from my tan rectangle, and I actually have 2 different pieces because I'm just using up the ends of the cuts that I did for the kits. You will have a rectangle. We want to cut 2 2¼ inch squares and cut them in half on the diagonal. If you're using the squared ruler, if you remember, there is a chart over on the side. We're doing a 2-inch finished square and a square block, and it says to cut 2 1/4 inch squares and cut them in half on the diagonal. So that matches. So since I'm doing 2 different pieces, it's going to be a little different. You can just clean cut your long edge and then your short edge, and then cut a 4½ inch wide strip and cut that in half to get your 2 1/4. Since I am cutting it from 2 different pieces, I'm just going to cut a 2 1/4 inch square twice. So there's 1 square, and we want to cut it in half once on the diagonal. So line your ruler up point to point. If you want to make sure you're being really accurate, you can line up a 45-degree line. I'm not going to worry about it because we trimmed down the square and a square units. There's 2. And because I was using 2 different pieces, I'm going to clean cut again 2 edges. And then cut a 2 1/4 inch square from this piece. And cut it in half on the diagonal, so corner to corner, and trim. We're going to take these 4 triangles and put them with our red and gold piece, because those are going to be a square and a square unit. Our gold square and our brown square are going to be cut down to the same size. The pattern says 3 1/4 inches, and if you're just going to cut it and make them to size, then go ahead and do that. But if you want to use the wing clipper, then remember we went over here and our large square was cut at 3 1/2 inches. So I'm going to cut mine at 3 1/2, and I'm going to cut them both at once. And you should have enough fabric to do it, because I always cut your pieces just a little bit bigger than what the pattern called for. So. And since I have them stacked, rather than moving my squares, I'm going to flip my mat around and finish up my 3 1/2 inch squares. So I'm lining up a line on my 2 edges that I just cut, and cut. This piece that the pattern is calling a beige print rectangle, it says to cut into 1 7/8 inch squares, but once again I'm using the wing clipper, so these are going to be my 4 small squares. So if we go over, they say cut at 2 inches, so I'm going to cut 4 2-inch squares instead of 4 1 7/8 inch squares. So 4 times 2 is 8, so I'm going to cut a rectangle to start that is 2 by 8. And Then I am going to back up to the 6-inch mark and the 4-inch mark, and the 2-inch mark. And that gives me my 4 squares, and remember I'm making them at 2 inches rather than 1 7/8. My small beige squares are going to go into a pile with my brown, my large brown square. My small red squares are going to go into a pile with my larger gold square. So we have 4 stacks now. We have this one with the larger red squares and our beige and red. We have this one with our red center and 4 triangles. We have this one with our brown square and our beige and red squares. We have this one with the gold and the red. We're going to take our first stack, which was the red and the beige squares are the same size, and on the wrong side of the beige squares we are going to either draw one line point to point on each square, or use your magic wand, line up the line on the magic wand on the points and draw on both sides of it. Remember, if you mark one line, you stitch 1/4 of an inch away. If you mark 2 lines, you're going to stitch on the lines. And I'm just using a mechanical pencil. If you don't draw too dark, that is fine. So I have my lines marked, and now I'm going to match it right sides together with a red. And we're going to stitch either, if you drew one line 1/4 of an inch away from that line, or if you drew 2, stitch on those lines. Either way, you get 2 rows of stitching. Once I've sewn my 2 lines of stitching, and I did chain piece, I can cut my pieces apart, and then we're just going to cut. You can use a rotary cutter if you want, or scissors between those 2 lines to separate them. And if I was using a rotary cutter, I would just put my ruler down point to point and cut in half. And now we are going to press toward the tan, because that's the side the pattern says to press toward. After pressing the half square triangle blocks, we are going to trim them down to 2.5 inches square. If you do not have a block lock, you can use a square ruler. You just line up that 45-degree line on the line, clean cut 2 edges, then rotate and cut it down to 2.5. I do have the block lock, and since I do, I'm going to use it. So I'm going to line up the groove, and remember the point needs to be on the seam. I'm going to make sure that I have 2.5 inches down here. Once I'm sure of that, I'm going to trim 2 sides, rotate the ruler, slide down to the 2.5 inch mark here on this end, and trim. Let me do another one. Make sure the point's on the seam. Make sure you have 2.5 inches down here. We're going to clean cut 2 edges, rotate the ruler. I keep moving it out of camera range, and slide back to my 2.5 inch mark. So cut down all 4 of those just like that. We want 2.5 inch squares from those. The next stack we're going to work with is our square squared pieces. So we're going to sew triangles onto the opposite sides of our center square. Remember, if you're using a square and a square unit, our square is our most accurate piece. So I want to sew with that on the top so that I can make sure I'm getting my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once I have stitched that, I'm going to press away from the center square. Once I have sewn these 2 triangles on and pressed, I'm going to add the last 2 to the other 2 sides. And again, I'm going to sew with my square on top. And remember, we only need to visually center our triangles. They don't have to be exact, because we are going to trim this down. We're going to trim down our square and a square unit to 2.5 inches. If you do not have the square squared ruler, half of 2.5 is 1 1/4. So you would line your 1 1/4 inch mark up with all 4 corners, trim 2 sides, rotate, and cut it down to 2.5 inches. I do have the square squared ruler, so I'm going to use it. We're doing a 2 inch finished square and a square unit. So I'm going to line up the 2-inch cross hatch marks with the points on my red center. And I'm going to trim 2 sides, rotate, and now I can line up my 2.5-inch mark on the 2 sides I just cut. My 2-inch crosshatch marks should still match up with the corners inside, and trim. And there's my 2.5-inch square and a square unit. Now we're going to make 8 flying geese units. 4 will be out of this color combination, 4 will be out of this color combination. On the wrong side of the small squares, you can mark either one line point to point, and then you would sew 1/4 of an inch away from that line, or you can use a magic wand, line up the line on the center of the magic wand point to point, and draw a line on each side like this. And we would do that, we're going to do that to all 8 pieces. When we have used this method before, and if you're using the measurements from the pattern, we line up our small squares exactly with the edge of the large square. However, if you choose to use the wing clipper, we're going to nudge these in just a little bit from the edge. You want about a 1/16 of an inch showing on the edge. So it would look something like that, just a little bit showing through. And then we're going to go and sew on both of our lines, or 1/4 of an inch away from our single line on both sides. So I would do the same thing on the gold one. I would line up my small red squares, leaving a very small margin, about a 1/16 of an inch, all the way around the side. And then same thing on the other end, and we're going to stitch on the lines, or 1/4 of an inch away from our center line. Okay, now this method, we're still cutting them apart just like we did before. So scissors or rotary cutter, your choice, between our stitching lines. Just like this. And then we're going to go press this, and the seam will be pressed toward our small triangles now. Once we've pressed, we're ready to add our other square. If you are not using the wing clipper, then you're going to want to line up your edges exactly if you cut to the measurements in the pattern. But if you are using the wing clipper, on this we're also going to slide back and have a little bit of our bigger square showing, so about a 1/16 of an inch. And again, if you marked one line, you're going to stitch 1/4 of an inch away from that line on both sides. If you mark 2, you're going to stitch on the line. I've sewn my last square onto all these units, and now once again we are going to cut them apart. Rotary cutter or scissors will work. Be careful if you're doing what I'm doing, because you're likely to cut your fabric. You don't want to do that. Scissors would be a better idea for cutting these apart. Okay, so again, we are going to cut these units in half between the stitching lines, and then we are going to press again out toward our small triangle. Now we need to trim down our flying geese units. If you are not using the wing clipper, you can use a regular ruler to trim these down to 1.5 by 2.5. It's 1.5 high by 2.5 wide. Half of 2.5 is 1.25, so we would want to line up our 1.25 mark on the point. We want to get it as straight as we can on here. You will not have this much to trim off if you're using the measurements in the pattern. Then we would trim 2 sides, rotate, and finish trimming it down to 1.5 by 2.5. If you are using the wing clipper, it has markings for the trimming. This is when we're finally going to use a ruler. So we're going to use the 2.5 and 1.5 lines. These are the cut sizes, not the finish sizes. And then these marks up here, the crosshatch marks, are for lining up with the point on our flying geese unit. So I'm going to line up the 1.5 by 2.5, that crosshatch mark right there, and I have a little bit to trim off all the way around, not a ton, but a little bit. So there's a line running here, crosshatch mark, and I'm making sure it's all fitting in the 1.5 by 2.5. I'm going to trim 2 sides. And then I can rotate my ruler, and I'll rotate and again, I have marks that run across and they sit right on the seam lines now. When I rotate it, they're here. This line stays consistent. It's always on the same seam line. So I can line up my 1.5 and my 2.5 marks, and those lines should be going across the seams. Oops, I don't want to slide while I'm cutting. You could put some non-slip stickers on here and trim. And so there's my nice, perfect little flying geese unit. I have my perfect 1/4 inch up there. Let me do one more. So we start with the crosshatch marks along the edge. We're going to line that up with the point. Make sure that our 2.5 and 1.5 is all fitting in there, which it is. Trim 2 sides. And then we're going to rotate the ruler. So I have the lines lining up with my seams. I also have the lines lining up with the 2 sides I just cut. And trim. Once all the flying geese units are trimmed down, we are going to sew them together into pairs. So the gold and red are going to be at the top, so the red is going to be our top edge and the bottom is going to be our bottom edge. When I'm stitching these, I want to sew with the brown and cream on top, because then I can see this point right here where our seams intersect, and I can hit it while I'm sewing exactly on. Here are my flying geese units. They are now 2.5 inch squares. We are pressing away from the brown toward the gold, so it looks like that on the back. Now that we have all the different units together, we can sew this together. It's just a 9 patch at this point. So I'm going to do a row, and a row. Just make sure you keep the orientation correct. I would suggest laying it out and taking it to your sewing machine and sitting it there while you sew. My 3 rows are sewn together. The top and the bottom row press the seams away from the center, and much as it bothers me to press toward a point, there are fewer points in the middle row than there are on the top and bottom one on the edges. So we're pressing in toward the center on the middle row. And now our seams are going in opposite directions here and here, so they will match. When I sew this, I'm going to sew with my middle row on top, because there are far more points on this row to watch than there are on this row. So they just get sewn together, the 3 rows, to make a complete unit. Here's my finished Illinois block. It should measure 6.5 inches at this point. For my last pressing, I pressed away from the center just because there were fewer points and it wanted to go that way more than it wanted to go the other way. Our second block this month is the Morning Star block, and you have 4 larger pieces of colored fabric, and then 4 smaller pieces of colored fabric, and then a white print for this block. I have already sprayed all of my fabric with starch or best press or sizing, whatever you're using, and pressed it dry. Our larger pieces of colored fabric we're going to trim down to 3 3/4 inches square. Your pieces are probably a little more square than mine because I took what was left on the fold. I try to give you guys pieces that don't have creases as much as possible. Some of you may have pieces like this. So I am going to square up 2 sides just like usual. And I'm cutting all of mine at once because you know I like to live on the edge when it comes to cutting. And because I have 4 of them stacked up, I'm not going to turn my fabric. I'm going to turn my mat. And we want it to be 3 3/4. So I'm going to line my 3 3/4 mark up with the 2 edges I just cut and trim down. So there's my 4 squares that are 3 3/4. The smaller rectangles I'm cutting down to 2.5 by 3 3/4. Again, I have all of mine stacked up at once. You don't have to. You can do them one at a time. I am going to clean cut 2 edges. And again, rather than moving that stack, I'm going to rotate the mat. So 2.5, I'm going to put that along my long edge and 3 3/4 along my short edge, and always double check so you don't have to come see me hoping there's more fabric. So 2.5, 3 3/4, and trim. From our white strip, we need 1 square that's 2.5 inches and 16 squares that are 1.5 inches. So I'm going to just cut my 2.5 inch section off of here first so they don't mess anything up. So I clean cut the short end, whacked off a 2.5 inch section, and now I can finish cutting it down to 2.5 inches square. So there we go. And then for our 16 1.5 inch squares, we are going to be cutting a grid that is 2 squares wide by 8 squares long. 1.5 times 8 is 12. So I have a clean edge down on the short part where I was cutting my 2.5. I'm going to line up the 12-inch mark right here on the short edge. I haven't done any clean cutting yet. So I'm going to cut and cut off the other end. You should have a little bit of extra. And then 1.5 times 2 is 3 inches, so I'm going to cut this strip 3 inches wide. And then I'm going to cut it in half to have 2 strips that are 1.5 inches wide. You can just cut your 1.5 inch strips and then cut them off one at a time. I'm going to try not to do that. If I don't move it, 12 minus 1.5 is 10.5. So I can put my 10.5 mark down here on the short end. Make sure I have my lines lined up with the long edges to keep everything straight. And cut. 10.5 minus 1.5 is 9. So I can slide back to the 9-inch mark. Again, I'm keeping lines straight with the long edges. 9.5 minus 9 minus 1.5 is 7.5. And cut, and then 6. And cut, and 4.5. Cut 3, and 1.5, and cut. On the wrong side of all the little white squares, we're going to draw one diagonal line. I am using the magic wand just as a straight edge. Any ruler will work. You don't need the magic wand. I'm not using it that way. So one diagonal line, corner to corner. We're going to put a white square on each corner of our rectangles, but let's just start with one. It's going to go like that so that the line is going diagonally across. It is not going into the corner like that. It's going this way. And the pattern says to stitch on the line you drew. I would suggest that you stitch actually just like 1 thread width away from the line out toward the corner, because that will give you a little more space for turning it. So we're going to do that on all 4 of our rectangles. Just start with 1. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this on camera. I did not stitch on the line. I stitched right next to it out toward the outside corner. And here's why. Because when I go to flip that corner up, I want it to go all the way to the edge, And my thread is going to take up a little bit of space when I flip it over to press it. Once you're certain that when you flip that white square up, it's going to go all the way to the edge, and I would check it, then we're going to trim off our extra. We want to trim the small triangle out toward the outside edge. So I'm going to put my ruler down on my stitching line, and I'm going to trim just the small triangle. Don't trim on the other side of our seam allowance. I'm going to trim that off, and that's my excess, so I'm left with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I will go ahead and press toward the white triangle. The next thing I'm going to do is add another white square on the opposite corner. Again, I'm going to sew just to the side of my marked line toward the outside corner. And once I've stitched that, then I will come back in exactly the same way and add the other 2 corners. Once you have your little diamond units ready made, then we're really just putting it together into an irregular 9 patch. So we're going to go row, row, row. And you can arrange the colors any way you want. And then just sew it together. Once my rows are together, I press the bottom and top rows away from the center and the center row toward the center. And now we're just going to sew the rows together. Here's our finished morning star block, and once we put the rows together, then our star appears in the middle. This block should measure 9 inches at this point. For my pressing on the rows, I press the seams in toward the center. The points were a little less sharp this way, it seemed, than this way, and they wanted to go that way. But it doesn't really matter. You could press it open if you wanted less bulk.